So good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's talk. We'll just give maybe a minute or so for any stragglers to join. Basically, my name is Alan, and I am the museum manager of the Northern Ireland War Memorial. For any of you that don't know us, we are a museum based in Belfast, and we look at Northern Ireland during the Second World War. So we look at the home front, very much the home front, how Northern Ireland was affected by it. We don't really look at European theatre of operations or the Far East or Pacific or anything like that. Very much how normal people, how Northern Irish people were affected by the Second World War. I'm very pleased to welcome you all tonight. I'm very pleased to see so many of you joining us tonight for Michael's talk. Michael is our Outreach Officer, and this talk is then just to mark LGBT History Month, something new for us as well. So we're very pleased that we're able to mark this in some form. It's not something we've actually done before. So before I really, if any further ado, I just want to hand over to Michael without any delay, and we'll get started.
Thanks, Alan. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be with you tonight. And as Alan said, my name is Michael Fry. I'm the Outreach Officer for the Northern Ireland War Memorial. And as he's just said, this is the first time the museum is marking LGBT History Month. So we're really pleased to be able to do this. And tonight's talk, as you will know already, is entitled Bad Companions, a study of queer life during the Second World War. And in this talk, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be looking at the experience of queer people during the Second World War, particularly in the UK. Although, as you might expect for somebody who works for the Northern Ireland War Memorial, I'm going to be also touching a lot on the local experience of queer people here in Northern Ireland during the war years as well. I'm going to share my screen, and I'll start my presentation. And I'd encourage you, by the way, if you have any questions or comments, I'd be very glad to pick those up at the end. But even if you, during the course of the presentation, if there's anything in particular that maybe strikes a note or that you're interested in or you want to comment on, then just put that in the chat, and we'll pick that up at the end of the talk. So perhaps there's no better place to start tonight's talk than Belfast author Brian Moore's 1965 novel, The Emperor of Ice Cream. And actually last year was Brian Moore's centenary, so there was a lot of attention on his novels, including this one. And in this coming of age story, Moore tells the story of Gavin Burke, a Belfast teenager who takes a job as a first aider at an air raid precautions post in the early months of the Second World War. The author draws heavily on his own wartime experiences, particularly witnessing the death and destruction caused on Belfast during the Belfast Blitz of 1941. And the reason I mention the novel, though, is because there's a wonderful scene in it in which Gavin, the central character, comes across three men in a Belfast youth club. One of whom, the Reverend Kenneth McMurtry, is a Protestant minister and a former rugby player. The other two, Matthew Ware and Maurice Markham, are rather camp, shall we say, young men who write poetry and play with toy puppet theatres. And although Gavin is initially very attracted to this slightly unfamiliar bohemian scene, smelling of joss sticks, it's one that he thinks is very cultured compared to his Catholic upbringing. It's only after Gavin leaves when the penny finally drops that these three men are actually gay. His friend Freddie reveals the truth to him, and a horrified Gavin's inner voice tells him this: the minister too? Homosexuals. I warned you, Freddie would introduce you to bad companions. And if you were charmed by them, you even wanted to imitate them. Think that one over. Gavin's description of bad companions is what I took as the title for this talk. But I think this scene is interesting, not only because Brian Moore has very probably drawn on his own personal experience, as he has throughout this novel, but also because I think this scene is a reminder of a world that must indeed have existed behind closed doors in wartime Belfast. Here's an image of High Street in Belfast around the 1930s, certainly before the Belfast Blitz of 1941, when so much destruction rained down on this part of the city centre. It's a world also alluded to, for example, by the English artist Neville Johnson, who lived in Belfast during the war and later said this about Belfast. People talk of the swaying 60s as a breakaway to license, as a nose thumb to convention, but even in the 40s, in sturdily provincial Belfast, the seeds of revolt were pushing through the fabric. On the surface, it was a polite society, but beneath this crust, in nests of anarchy and deviation, fanned and feathered by children of the manse, orgies took place and mayhem prevailed. More of provincial orgies later. Perhaps though one of the most obvious ways in which the Second World War affected queer life was in terms of the armed forces, particularly in the context of conscription, which meant that by 1941, all men in Great Britain between the ages of 18 and 51, and all women between the ages of 20 and 30 were eligible to be called up for military service. And this meant, of course, that many tens of thousands of queer people found themselves in uniform during the war. Indeed, one estimate has speculated that it might have been as much as 400,000 servicemen and women who identified as queer out of a total of 6.5 million who served in the armed forces during the Second World War. And what seems clear is that the demand for manpower meant that the authorities often ignored a recruit's sexuality during the required medical examination, even when that was manifestly obvious. This is a photograph of Terry Gardner, and as you can perhaps guess, Terry Gardner was a drag artist before the Second World War, and this is a photo of Terry in drag in 1946. And when Terry was called up as part of conscription, he didn't want to join the armed forces. He wanted to continue his lucrative career in show business. And he was advised by his friends to really camp it up to be completely outrageous in front of the medical board, and that would ensure that he would be rejected. Well, unfortunately for Terry, despite his best attempts, he was passed and he was sent into the Navy as a cook. Indeed, historian Emma Vickers, who's written about same-sex desire in the British Armed Forces during the war, she suggests that in the event that queer men and women were identified by medical boards, it's likely that most were accepted because the authorities believed that they could be remolded and straightened out, if you'll pardon the pun, by military discipline. So what was life like then for these men and women while they were in uniform? Well, some of the richest sources of information we have are the oral history accounts that we have from queer veterans as they're reflected on their wartime service later on in life. And what comes across from many of these accounts is that by being brought together with members of the same sex in an environment which encouraged both personal intimacy and the formation of close personal relationships, there were plenty of opportunities for service personnel to explore same-sex desire. As one RAF veteran recalled 60 years later, let's face it, you're queer and you're surrounded by men. I was living in a man's world and I was queer, and you can't ask for much more than that. Similarly, Sarah Allen, who was interviewed in 1990, described the start of the war as, quote, a godsend, because it meant she could escape home life and the succession of uninteresting boyfriends, as she put it, that she had been dating. She joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the ATS, the women's branch of the army, and discovered a small contingent of queer women in her unit, through whom she experienced her first physical relationship with a woman during her wartime service. Certainly, there were long-standing practices already embedded within the services that lent themselves to same-sex activity. For example, in the Royal Navy, there was what was called the wingers and oppos system, where wingers were senior men who were assigned to mentor new recruits, and oppos were seamen of a similar age and rank to recruits who were expected to guide them. This is John Beardmore, who joined the Navy in 1939 as a teenager and eventually became a sub-lieutenant on the Arctic convoys. And he recalled how some young married officers had wanted to become his winger, and not always with a purely philanthropic motive in mind. Of the oppo relationship, he said it was much more equal because he was with his peers. And this is John Beardmore's description of how the oppo relationship worked. He said, you shared duties and he looked after your tot of rum when you were in duty and put you to bed when you came back from shore pissed. It was largely platonic, but in some cases it developed into a sexual relationship which went on after the war had ended. I know of fellows who were oppos and who were having affairs at the time who went on to become godfathers to each other's children. Similarly, in the army and the RAF, there was the system of employing young men who were called batmen to serve as personal servants to the officers. And again, we know from first-hand accounts of veterans how these relationships were sometimes rooted in sex. Of course, as you maybe picked up from John Beardmore's description of the oppo relationship in the Navy, many of these men would probably not have described themselves as queer. In fact, what seems to have happened is that the need for sexual relief, coupled with the fear of perhaps catching a venereal disease from visiting a brothel, meant that otherwise heterosexual servicemen would quite happily use their queer comrades to satisfy their needs. So, for example, Dennis Prattley, who was a rating in the Navy and was interviewed in 1998 for the BBC Time Watch documentary, he talked about his pride in fulfilling an emotional function for the men aboard his ship. He said that he made a lot of boys happy and that he did his bit for his country, with one of his crewmates telling him that he reminded him of my girl back home. Obviously, though, there were limits to these wartime relationships. So, for example, one RAF airman, Charles Pepper, he recalled how he bumped into a former regular sexual partner on the train after the war, and he said the man couldn't get out of the train compartment quick enough. Quite apart from sex, queer men also clearly played an important role in keeping up military morale during the Second World War. Terry Gardner, the drag queen turned Navy cook, regularly entertained his comrades by camping it up during the war. He said, everyone likes to laugh whatever the circumstances, and believe me, there were some dreadful, dreadful circumstances, especially on the Western approaches. People were just thankful to get through the day, and of course, if I was around to give them a laugh, it was a bonus, wasn't it? Similarly, John Beardmore recalled a coder on his ship who had been a chorus boy in peacetime and whose action station was to relay the captain's orders to the forward guns. To ease the tension of battle, when the captain issued orders to fire to this coder, the coder would simply repeat, "Open fire, dear," which would crack everyone up. As Beardmore described him, he was called Freddie and was immensely popular on ship. Everyone loved him and he loved everyone else. Supposedly, Freddie would also break into impersonations of Vera Lynn and Gracie Fields whenever the stress became too much for everyone. Similarly, one army veteran described two queer men under his command camping it up just as they were about to disembark from their landing craft during the D-Day landings, including one of them putting on lipstick and saying, "I must look pretty for the Germans." As this veteran later put it, you couldn't help but laugh at them, not because they were inadequate, but because they had the bloody courage to laugh. They had this amazing capacity to see the ridiculous part of life. I think they felt they'd got to be brave in front of the straight lot. Clearly then, camping it up was often as much about the queer serviceman proving his courage to his comrades as it was about keeping everyone's morale up in the face of adversity. Back in the UK, the women's branches of the armed forces also saw plenty of same-sex activity. For example, one Scottish veteran of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the WAF, Elizabeth Reed Simpson, she was interviewed in 1998 for the Imperial War Museum's Oral History Collection, and she remembered that there were quite a few lesbians in the WAF. She reminisced about one occasion when she was stationed in Northern Ireland. She was certainly at RAF Ballyhalbert in County Down, so it may well be the case that this story took place there. And she said that she came across a female couple at the station who slept together. After complaining about the noise coming from where they were meant to be on night duty, Elizabeth was told this by another woman: "Where were you brought up? Don't you know anything? They're lesbians and they always manage to get posted together. They don't fancy you, so get back to bed and go to sleep and don't bother about them." When she was then asked by the oral history interviewer if the relationship was accepted by the rest of the unit, Elizabeth said people just tended to ignore them. Perhaps also at this point, I should mention the rather remarkable story of Jonathan Ferguson, born as Joy Ferguson in Lurgan in County Armagh in 1915, and who served as a female pilot with the Air Transport Auxiliary, the ATA, during the war. Supposedly, Jonathan was not regarded by colleagues during his time in the ATA as a lesbian woman, although even during that period, it was felt he was presenting a rather masculine appearance for a woman of that time. In 1958, working as a civil servant in London, Jonathan then underwent gender reassignment, and he changed his name from Joy, his birth name, and became Jonathan, something that received some press attention at the time. And you'll see on screen a clipping from the Liverpool Echo. A number of newspapers covered the story in 1958. What's also really interesting is that Jonathan managed to get his name and sex changed on his birth certificate, as well as the entry in the original register of births in Northern Ireland changed. And that was something that was certainly highly unusual at the time. He died in 1974 in England, and Nina Baker, who has written up Jonathan's story for her Women Engineers History blog, she has asked me to say tonight that if anyone has any information about Jonathan's early life growing up in Lurgan, he actually attended Lurgan College as well, then she would be very glad to hear from them. And she's given me permission to share Jonathan's story tonight. Now, in relating these stories, I don't want to give the impression that somehow queer people didn't have any problems serving in the armed forces, because of course, under military law, as under civilian law at the time, same-sex activity between men was a disciplinary offence. And certainly much of a queer man's survival in the armed forces seemed to depend on the willingness of his officers or comrades to turn a blind eye, the particular culture of a military unit, or indeed how discreet the individual serviceman was. Interestingly, though, Emma Vickers has shown that the charge of what was called indecency was actually not a major problem for the armed forces during the war, with only 1,800 servicemen in the Army, Royal Navy and RAF facing a court-martial for indecency out of a total of 5.9 million men who served during the course of the war. In the women's services, although same-sex activity was not punishable under military law, it was officially disapproved of, particularly in cases where it could be shown to be disruptive to military discipline. The director of the WAF, Janetrophusforbes, she wrote this about lesbianism in a 1941 memo. In approaching an airwoman whom we are fairly convinced is a lesbian, or in approaching one whose behaviour is such as to suggest she is, we should point out to her that her behaviour is that of a schoolgirl, and that these sentimental attachments are not what we expect from airwomen who must necessarily always set an example to others. That unless she can behave herself as a sensible adult, we consider that she will have a detrimental effect on discipline generally, and we would have to dispense with her services. And that certainly seems to have been the approach both in the WAF and also in the ATS. Now, I've talked a lot about the armed forces so far, but obviously we can't forget the home front and the experience of queer people, including those who were in uniform and either stationed or on leave in towns and cities during the war. So, for example, historian Matt Holbrook has written a terrific book about queer London that includes the period between 1939 and 1945. And he mentions the fact that there were well-established both commercial and public queer networks from at least the 1920s in places like Blackpool, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, and Brighton, all of which seem to have been in full swing during the war years. In London itself, there were plenty of queer bars, clubs, and cafes, while men looking for sex with other men often found it in public toilets and parks across the city. The blackout also certainly helped to facilitate this kind of activity. Quentin Crisp, the writer and actor who became famous later in life for his autobiography, The Naked Civil Servant, and who incidentally was one of the very few queer men who was turned down for military service because of his dyed hair and his plucked eyebrows. Well, Crisp said this of London at the time, and I think this is a very evocative description of London during the war years and the blackout. He said, "The city became like a paved double bed. Voices whispered suggestively as you walked along, hands reached out if you stood still, and in dimly lit trains, people carried on as they had once behaved only in taxis. Once when I emerged from Leicester Square Underground Station, I asked an invisible passerby where I was. He kissed me on the lips, told me I was in Newport Street, and walked on." Quite a description of wartime London. And incidentally, it is worth mentioning in passing that Crisp loved the Americans. And we know, of course, that 1.5 million Americans came to the UK during the war, including 300,000 who arrived in Northern Ireland. Just a couple of weeks ago, we marked the 80th anniversary of the arrival of the Americans in Northern Ireland. And Crisp said of the Americans, again, very evocatively, he said, quote, "They flowed through the streets of London like cream on strawberries, like melted butter on peas. Above all, it was the liberality of their natures that was so marvelous. Never in the history of sex was so much offered to so many by so few. No wonder he later moved to New York." And what was true of London was also true, of course, albeit on a smaller scale, of provincial cities like Belfast. For example, Jeff Dudgeon and Doug Sobey tell me that they knew someone later in life, a countryman from beyond Lisburn who was in his early 20s during the war. And they told me that he said that he was very put out during the war years because of the large numbers of people sleeping in the fields around Belfast, ditching as it was called, because of the fear of the air raids. And the reason he was so put out was because these were the places where he used to meet a soldier friend for sex. Also worth mentioning is Dubarry's, which was just off Queen Square behind the Albert Clock. And for many years, it was a queer venue, as well as somewhere that was shared with sex workers. You see here, this is an advertisement from the Belfast Telegraph in 1944. And you see the tagline at the bottom, the picture of the Albert Clock. And it says in the tagline at the bottom, "Good liquor, good music," and then in inverted commas or quotation marks, "atmosphere. I'll let you decide what they meant by atmosphere." Interestingly, I have been told by Tom Hume, who is an academic at Queen's University and a historian researching local queer history. He's told me that police records show that in 1941, a soldier was caught with a civilian at the nearby Queen's Quay, and certainly that area around the docks seems to have been something of a cruising ground. And this brings me on then to a couple of case studies, which again, Tom was kind enough to point out to me as examples of local same-sex activity during the war. Although, as is so often the case with queer history, we only know about them because the men involved were caught and charged by the authorities. One of these incidents took place at Great Victoria Street in Belfast on the night of 26th November 1939. And what you can see here is a photograph of the Great Northern Railway Station in Great Victoria Street. And indeed, this was a well-known cruising ground for queer men. The public urinals there for a long time were one of the main cottages, as they were called, in Belfast. And on the night of 26 November 1939, in Great Victoria Street, a soldier, Robert James Jess, approached a civilian, Walter Bradshaw, and asked him for a cigarette. It was about 11:30 at night. Now, bear in mind that asking for a light or for a cigarette was often a pickup tactic at the time to find out if the other man was interested. And in this case, according to the news reports of the trial, Bradshaw gave Jess a cigarette and they got into conversation. Jess said that he was not going back to his barracks that night as he was late and he would be punished. So he said that he was going to stay out all night and he quite fancied a cup of tea. And at this point, they then went back to Bradshaw's aunt's house in Wesley Street. And this is the point at which we don't know exactly what happened. Bradshaw claimed that Jess, the soldier, attacked him in the parlour, punching him in the mouth, hitting him on the head with an ornament, and then throwing him on the ground. When he came to, He said Jess then hit him with a flower pot and Bradshaw was knocked unconscious again. Eventually, he managed to shout for help and his cousin and his aunt came on the scene. Unfortunately for Jess, he left his gas mask and an insurance card with his name on it behind, which is how the police eventually tracked him to Willowfield Barracks. In the statement he gave to the police, Jess said that Bradshaw was the one who had attacked him and that he had knocked the flower pot out of his head whenever he was going to throw it at him. However, given that then Jess refused to give evidence in court whenever they went for trial in January 1940, and given the fact that Bradshaw had clearly been seriously injured, had a number of injuries on his person, given these circumstances, the jury found Jess guilty of assault after deliberating for less than 2 minutes. And Jess was sentenced to 12 months imprisonment with hard labour. Now, we will never know, of course, what exactly happened that night. But interestingly, Tom Hume tells me that the original criminal file that he has access to in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland is much more explicit about the sexual element of this case than the newspaper report, including the fact that Jess was actually charged with assault with the intent to commit buggery. And certainly as well, the fact that he was sentenced to imprisonment with hard labour, that seems to have been a common sentence for those convicted of crimes of gross indecency. The other local case I want to mention took place in Derry, Londonderry, in May 1944. According to the coverage of the case in the Londonderry Sentinel, 2 Royal Canadian Navy sailors, Thomas McMahon and Raymond Lindstrom, were charged with larceny, what we would today call theft, of money from a US Army Lieutenant, Ernest Bartos. Lieutenant Bartos told police that he left Belfast with 2 army nurses on the 5:25 p.m. train for Derry, and he had a number of drinks, adding, quote, "I must have been in pretty bad shape because I do not remember checking in at the hotel." In the hotel, he was joined by 2 Canadian sailors, one of whom he gave money to buy a bottle of whiskey from the hotel bellboy. When the bellboy refused, the sailor, McMahon, said he then returned to the room where he saw the officer on his back with a naval rating on his chest. As it turned out, the naval rating was Lindstrom. Lindstrom, for his part, claimed in a statement that the officer had interfered with him while they were in the room together. The officer Bartos's version of the story is that he woke up in his room to find 2 sailors there, and that when he woke up again later that evening, his breast pocket was open and £14, the equivalent today of about £500 in banknotes, had disappeared from his pocket. After giving a statement to the police, according to the papers, Lieutenant Bartos shortly afterwards left the country. Rather conveniently, you might say, given the circumstances. And although the larceny charge against both sailors was dropped, mainly because the resident magistrate said they were all drunk and clearly none of them seemed to know what they were doing, Lindstrom was then subsequently charged with gross indecency, for which he was sentenced to 3 months imprisonment with hard labour. Actually, originally, the judge wanted to sentence him to 12 months with hard labour, but the jury recommended a reduced sentence because of the excuse that Lindstrom had drank so much alcohol that he didn't realise what he was doing. Again, it would be interesting to see what the original police file reveals about the details of this case, but certainly reading the newspaper reports, it's enough to maybe give us a fair idea of what went on in that Derry hotel room. Of course, we can only guess how many of these kinds of encounters must have taken place during the war and never came to the attention of the authorities. But what seems clear from the oral history accounts that we have is that, in the words of queer historian Matt Holbrook, quote, "For many men, the war was a kind of sexual utopia, containing freedoms and possibilities both before and after." This is especially true given that in the post-war years, there was something of a backlash against queer men, something that's been attributed to various factors, including concerns over the apparent decline in sexual morality, rising divorce rates, and the declining national birth rate. Rejecting wartime morality and emphasizing the nuclear family, in the 1950s, the UK saw an increased persecution of queer men, what was called, I think, in the United States, the Lavender Scare. And to quote, for example, from the Conservative Home Secretary of the time, Sir David Maxwell Fife, he said this: "Homosexuals in general are exhibitionists and proselytizers and are a danger to others, especially the young. And so long as I hold the office of Home Secretary, I shall give no countenance to the view that they should not be prevented from being such a danger." Those were his words in the House of Commons in December 1953. And certainly the figures speak for themselves. In 1938, 719 men were prosecuted for same-sex activity in England and Wales. In 1952, it had gone up to 2,109. No wonder then that Quentin Crisp later said of these years, "The horrors of peace were many." Let me conclude then with the words of one queer veteran called Roy, who was interviewed in the late 1970s in Manchester about his life experiences. By that stage, he was in the 70s and he was involved in the campaign for homosexual equality. Roy served in the Royal Army Medical Corps during the Second World War, and he said this of his time in the services: "It was such a lovely war. Oh, what went on was nobody's business. I went to Edinburgh. I was stationed there. The place was a riot, a riot. Yes, Edinburgh was a tremendous city. It was so full of sailors and quite easy, quite easy. The place was as if the world had gone mad because it was so easy." Well, it may not have been a lovely war for everyone. There's no doubt about that. But what I hope has come through in this talk is that in so many ways, the Second World War, with all its hardships, was still a time when being queer seems to have been much easier than other periods in our LGBT history. Certainly that was true for Roy, and I've no doubt that it was true for many other queer men and women, both in and out of uniform. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to finish there, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'd be very glad if anybody has any questions or comments you would like to share. Perhaps you want to mute yourselves. And maybe let Alan, if you want to chair this.
Yeah, certainly. So if any of you have any questions, just pop it either in writing in the chat option on your Zoom, or there's a little hand wave emoji signal. And then I will invite you to come forward to unmute yourself and you're free to ask Michael your question in person. Just before while people are doing that, maybe think about the questions. Just want to say thanks to Michael. It's as you picked up on from Michael, it's a really under-researched, under-talked about aspect of the Second World War, particularly from a local aspect as well. And Michael touched upon sort of the difficulties in trying to research that. And sort of the circumstances that come to life. I know there's a few other examples that Michael has that maybe didn't or he wasn't able to include tonight as well. But certainly, if there's any questions, please feel free. Michael certainly be very glad to or attempt to answer them at least. Anybody? I'm not too sure, Michael.
I really appreciate some of the comments that are coming through. I just want to echo what Alan said. It's definitely, I think it's fair to say that, and Alan would probably, I'm sure would agree with me, the social history of the Second World War, and particularly the social history of the Second World War in Northern Ireland, is relatively under-researched, although I'm so glad to see Brian Barton, one of our trustees here tonight, who is definitely one of the major experts, if not the major expert in the Second World War in Northern Ireland, without spare your blushes, Brian. But I think it's fair to say, certainly it's this aspect of the history of the Second World War, the queer history of the Second World War has only recently been examined. And as I kind of mentioned in the talk, it kind of reminds us of the importance of oral history. We in the museum run an oral history project, and our colleague Michael Burns has joined us tonight, and he runs that. And it's a reminder actually that There's such an urgency in recording these stories, the kind of stories that you don't find in the history books, and yet are, you know, just as important as any other stories, because they are representative of the real life lived experience of the war years. Brian, do you want to mute yourself?
No, just thank you very much, Michael. I really enjoyed the talk. So it was very lucid, very well informed, and a lot of good local anecdotal material. I would think that in general terms, I mean, the war did cause a certain level of laxity in conventional social mores at the time. And I presume that would have, you know, it would have expressed itself not just in perhaps more open expression of queerness, but also in terms of attitudes towards prostitution and the numbers involved in prostitution. Perhaps is there, you cited figures there of prosecutions for queer folk. Would there have been comparable patterns of prosecutions, for example, for prostitution after the war? Did they come back and hit them harder than they may have done through the war period?
I don't know, Brian. I mean, that's a really interesting question. It wouldn't surprise me. It's probably worth, this is maybe worth doing a plug, because we have Leanne McCormick, who is from Ulster University, Alan, yeah, who's written a lot about particularly the experience of women during the war. I actually just so happened to have, well, there's a book I was reading kind of in preparation for this about the experience of Irish women during the Second World War, or the experience of Irish women in war. And she's written about, for example, female sex workers during the Second World War, and a lot of the concerns there were, particularly I suppose on the part of the authorities, about you know, as you've said, the laxity in relationships, if it's the right way to put it, between women and, say, the American forces. And I think that's particularly what Leanne's going to be talking about, Alan, isn't it? Next month for the 80th anniversary, for the US 80 commemorations. So it would be interesting to know, was there the same persecution of females and as with queer men after the Second World War? I wouldn't be surprised. I really wouldn't be surprised.
Thanks, Michael. There's a few questions, Michael, in the comment section. I'll just pick some out. And if I've missed any, I do apologize. Feel free to message me and remind me of the questions there. There's a message from Amy who's asked just for you to forward a reading list to her, but I'll get her email address and we can respond to her tomorrow. But she wanted to know if you've ever discovered anything queer, any queer history of Campbell College or of any other all-boys school in Belfast, or anything. Have you ever came across anything like that?
No, although I am, yeah, well, actually, it just comes to mind, and Michael Burns would be able to confirm this, but there's a gentleman who's still living, who was interviewed as part of our oral history project, who went to Inst, I believe, who talked about one of the masters there was well known for, what's the right way to put it? Yes, he was a little bit hands-on, shall we put it, with some of the boys. I think that's the way he put it. Now, he doesn't, like, he says this in a way which is, you know, at the time it was just laughed at. I suppose today it would be taken much more seriously, but that was the culture of the time. And I believe he, according to this gentleman, this master then went on to work in a public school in England. So you get little anecdotes like that. I haven't come across anything in particular on Campbell College. Again, it's the sort of thing that sort of, you know, as I say, you know, just thinking of that particular oral history interviewee, it's the kind of thing you wouldn't necessarily find in a book, but it comes through in those first-hand memories. So thanks for the question, Amy.
Yeah, well, Michael, would you agree that that's the sort of thing it's sort of mentioned in passing, it's never really explicitly talked about, it's only really glossed over, sort of people don't think about it in that sort of sense?
Yeah, I mean, and another example, which I didn't mention in the talk, but really interesting, this same gentleman talks about being in the Lisburn Road during the Second World War, and there was an air raid warden in the area. And the rumor was amongst the neighborhood that he was a cross-dresser. And actually, they all were desperate that there would be an air raid siren and he would, have been cross-dressing and then, have to appear dressed like that. And again, the way this gentleman puts it, people didn't really take much notice of it. They thought it was kind of a curiosity, but they weren't going to report him to the authorities. It was just regarded as, one of those things that some people did. It's kind of, it's sort of echoing what that WAF veteran was saying about that lesbian couple at Ballyhalbert, that people just ignored it. It was just, yeah. So it's really interesting.
There's another question here from Chris Lee. He's looking to know if there are many sources illustrating the attitudes of the government or the armed forces chiefs. Is there evidence of like a look the other way or look the other way policy?
In terms of the senior officers, I'm not sure, Chris. I think if I was to recommend a book, just the one book for anyone to read about this topic, I would really encourage you to read Emma Vickers' book, Queen and Country. She's a lecturer in history at Liverpool John Moores University. And in that book, which a lot of which I use for tonight's talk, she looks at the whole experience of queer men and women during the Second World War in the armed forces. She looks at court-martials in a lot of detail. She looks at the experiences overseas. While there's a scarcity, I suppose, if it's fair to say, of official kind of references to this sort of activity in the likes of the National Archives at Kew in London. She's done a pretty good job, from what I can see, of being able to find official records. She also managed, this was about 15 years, it was published in 2013, but she did a lot of research in the early 2000s. She managed to interview about 10 or 11 queer veterans about their experiences. And she even says in the book she found it very difficult to find people who were willing to talk about their experiences, but those accounts are really fascinating because, again, they just reveal so much about an aspect of the war that, we just haven't really heard about until relatively recently. Yeah, I'll put it in the chat, Laura.
I've got it here, Michael.
Oh, thanks, Alan, thanks.
I sent it to Amy by accident there. Sorry, Amy. But yeah, so Michael, it's an interesting thing we talk about, like, turn the other cheek. But were many people that were trying to focus on the everyday person, but there were any examples of maybe people who were famously out, it was widely known that they were maybe gay, or that people just didn't. It was just a normal thing, and people just accepted that.
In the armed forces?
Yeah, or even just in life, particularly maybe from a local perspective, like Northern Irish people, or.
Well, I mean, there was Brian Desmond Hurst, who was not living in Belfast during the war, but many of you might know Brian Desmond Hurst was a film director, was born in Ribble Street in East Belfast. There's a blue plaque to him, actually, at the Strand Arts Centre, because he was from East Belfast. But he was a film director. Actually, in connection with the 80th anniversary of the Americans arriving this year, he directed a movie which you can find on YouTube called A Letter from Ulster, which is a kind of propaganda film about the Americans in Northern Ireland. But I think it's fair to say he was definitely out. I remember coming across a quotation. He identified as bisexual, and he said, "People ask me if I'm bisexual, but I'm actually trisexual, the Army, the Navy, and the Household Cavalry." As I say, he was based in London and was very much a part of the queer scene there, even up to the 1970s, was well known amongst theatre types, actors, really held court. So I made a couple of well-known movies in the 1950s, Scrooge with Alistair Sims, probably his most famous one, and Malta Story with Alec Guinness. as well. So he would be the main one that comes to mind from Northern Ireland anyway. But as I maybe indicated as well, there were certainly there were plenty of men who were out in the armed forces and women as well. And I guess it's what keeps coming across in the accounts I read is that it was, as Matt Holbrook put it, it was a kind of utopia for so many queer men and women. And it was kind of really unfortunate what happened in the 50s then, when the backlash started. And even the fact, of course, that when homosexuality was eventually decriminalized in 1967 in England and Wales, then in the 1980s, early 1980s in Scotland and Northern Ireland, it wasn't until 2000 that the armed forces allowed out men and women to serve. And even recently I saw, as you may have on the news, reports of servicemen and women veterans who were effectively kicked out of the armed forces as recently as the 1990s because of who they were. So we've come a long way in the past 80 or so years, but a lot of that change has maybe only come relatively recently, it has to be said, certainly in the armed forces.
There's a couple more questions, Michael. There's one from Sarah here who's asking if there's any history of the Brill Cream boys.
In terms of remind me of the Brill Cream boys,
Oh, you'll have to excuse my ignorance as well. I'm not too sure either.
Yeah.
I was hoping you would know.
American reference, Sarah, or I have heard Air Force, right? I haven't come across that particular reference, to be honest with you, Sarah. Forgive my ignorance.
It's something to look into then.
Yeah, definitely.
And there's another one just from Siobhan who says, refreshing to hear that some gay and lesbian service people were well liked and regarded, but have you come across any examples of overt homophobia or bullying within the forces?
Again, I think Emma Vickers picks up on some of this. I know Terry, the drag queen turned cook, talked about having some really difficult times. And I think the other thing that comes through in terms of some of the men and women who were court-martialed, for example, is the fact that very often it seemed to depend on what unit you were in or whether you were liked by your officer. There was a thing Emma Vickers talks about, the good fellow in inverted commas, and the idea that the good fellow was somebody who, if you were liked, then you would be accepted by your unit, and if you were discreet as well. The other really interesting thing, which maybe is related to this, is that in a lot of the first-hand accounts I've read of veterans, certainly male veterans, there's a little bit of resentment comes through about, shall we say, more camp men, men who maybe didn't make as much of an effort or couldn't make as much of an effort in terms of trying to disguise their queerness. So for example, I read a first-hand account of somebody living in London during the war who said that anytime Quentin Crisp was coming down the street, he used to cross the street. I think there was a certain amount of resentment because there was a feeling of you're drawing attention to us, you're drawing attention to yourself, you're going to make life difficult for us. So there was a certain amount of that as well. And there was a lot of what you might call passing, which is again something that Emma Vickers talks about, men making an effort to really, even in terms of, their barracks, maybe putting up a picture of a nice woman in a swimsuit to try to fit in with the boys, because of course, it's a very macho, masculine culture, and you can understand the efforts that they would have perhaps wanted to make to try to fit in with that.
I suppose really what you're trying to, what you're saying is, Michael, is a systematic homophobia as well, though, wasn't it? So the whole organization they were involved in, U.S. Army, the British Armed Forces, whoever, it was illegal. So it was really, so really if it was up to the commanding officer, or it was their call basically, and it was on their head as well if they overlook that that rule or that regulation, I guess, in terms of maybe morale, or in terms of as you said, they overlooked it in the fact that they were a good man or a good soldier instead. So
and even, you know, some of those stories I was talking about, gallantry, you know, I think there was a recognition these were brave men and women. You know, I think, for example, of Ian Gleed, who was an RAF pilot during the war when the DSO was killed in action. You know, but he would be an example of somebody who was very well liked, although it wasn't actually out, it seems. His partner talked about being in a relationship with him, or one of his partners talked about being in a relationship with him later in the 1990s. But there's no doubt that you know, a lot of these men and women were they didn't need to prove their bravery. It was quite evident.
I think Brian might want to come in, possibly on the Bill Cream Boys, Brian.
Yeah, Brian.
No, I'm not worried. No, I know nothing whatever about them. I mean, I've heard of them, but they mean nothing to me either. No, I was wondering, you know, the main source you'd be looking at there would be presumably oral records, newspaper files, court cases. So are those the main areas of you draw your material from?
Yeah, I think so, and it seems to be that's what most historians are working with. Certainly Tom Hulme at Queen's University, who's, you know, working on a major project at the minute, which is going to be looking at queer history in Northern Ireland from the 1880s through to the 1960s, so including the Second World War. You know, a lot of that will certainly regarding men, it's regarding criminal records, police records. So I suppose, as I mentioned, it's kind of one of those sad sort of aspects of queer history that it's just the reality that it was illegal, and that's so often it's a very rich source potentially of history, but it's also a sad one as well.
Sure.
Plenty of questions coming in here. Sorry, Brian, have you finished? Sorry.
No, that's fine.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Just plenty of questions. Michael's still coming in thick and fast, so I hope you're not too hungry. The Nigel asks, are there any other heroes or heroines in the forces in the works are being restored, similar to Alan Turing?
Alan Turing's definitely one of the major ones. I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. I think Nigel, I think what we're seeing now is, rather than thinking necessarily of, people as famous as Alan Turing, what we're getting now is a much fuller picture of the richness of queer life during the Second World War, including those who were in uniform. And we're getting those individual stories, and we're building up a better picture of how complex it was. And of course, I think I should mention in connection with this, there is a lot of mythology around the Second World War. And I think this is part of kind of deconstructing that mythology. This idea of, well, even if you take, for example, the Americans, and I think sometimes, I know I can perhaps be guilty of this, it's a very heteronormative story. The Americans coming over, the dances with women, about 1,800 of them married women in Northern Ireland. And it's understandable because it was such an obvious part of the experience of the Americans coming to Northern Ireland and to the wider UK. But as I say, people like Quentin Crisp definitely like them, and a lot of the Americans seem to have liked Quentin Crisp. So again, it's part of kind of bringing out that more accurate picture of what actually happened during the war years.
I think Nigel wants to come in here. So yeah, Nigel, do you want to unmute yourself and then you can ask a question?
Hi, Nigel.
Yes, hello. It's good to see you again, Michael. Very sorry for being late. It's absolutely typical of me, but
no, don't worry.
I'm going to have a look at this whenever it's published, because I missed 100% of it.
No, don't worry.
I thanks very much for elaborating on that, because the only thing that I know about anyone who was ever considered queer or gay, lesbian, whoever it might have been, but served in the forces either in Ireland or in the UK, all we know is that they were eventually pardoned, but we don't know anything about their backstory. what were the circumstances about how they were ever found out to be gay? Were they caught in the front lines, whatever? And, you know, what did they have at home? What was their craft? Who knows, maybe we will have an awful lot more stories whenever we sift through an awful lot more of the records, which is fortunately not my job. Thank you, Northern Ireland War Memorial.
Actually, another person that comes to mind is Dudley Cave, who died, I think, in the 1990s. He served in the Far East. He was captured by the Japanese at the fall of Singapore and worked on one of the Japanese railways and was lucky to survive the war. I think he got malaria and they moved him, and about 3/4 of his unit actually died in captivity. And he, very sadly, he survived the war and came back to London, and he was a manager of the Majestic Theatre, I think it was, in London. And when his employer discovered he was gay in 1954, I think it was, he was sacked. And later on in life, he got involved in gay equality campaigning, including he worked with Peter Tatchell, for example, in trying to draw attention to what he regarded as the continuing inequality in the armed forces for gay men and women, and the fact that the contribution of gay men like himself had not been recognized. So I think he died, unfortunately, before the armed forces dropped the, don't ask, don't tell rule, but he's certainly somebody that comes to mind in terms of a prominent gay veteran.
I think there's one. Amy's got another question, Michael. She's asking if there was a sense that the war offered a space for experimentation for men who would otherwise be considered straight in what would be a non-war or a civil society.
Absolutely, Amy, absolutely. One of the terms that's used both by Emma Vickers and Matt Holbrook is what's called homosex. So in other words, men who have sex with men, but who do not necessarily identify as queer or gay. And yeah, as I was kind of trying to bring out, there was a lot of that went on during the war. I won't be too explicit, but there was a lot of masturbation, for example. There was a lot of mutual masturbation, quite honestly. That seems to have been very common. And even it's, as I said, even the fact that John Beardmore was able to talk about the relationships in the Navy, and yet many of these men went on to become the godfathers of each other's children. You had these kind of strange, continuities after the war as well. So no, that's definitely true. That definitely did happen. Like a sort of by curiosity, yeah, Nigel, maybe. Maybe.
Michael, maybe we should have maybe a post-watershed version of this talk, maybe as well.
Perhaps.
Because I know certainly you referred to some of the cases Tom was looking at as well in the past, and certainly some of the cases that we've looked at as well. Certainly the Americans, stuff in the detail, especially the court cases, they don't really scrimp on the detail at all, sure they don't.
No, definitely not. Yeah, I've some of the accounts, certainly some of the first-hand accounts have come for, I've come across some of the men who were interviewed in the 1970s, like Roy I mentioned at the end. They're very explicit, and I think they it was part of their kind of liberation, if you like. There was a kind of sexual liberation for a lot of these men and women during the war years. There's no doubt about that. And I don't want to make it all about sex, obviously, but I do think it is one of those aspects of the war that people clearly enjoyed. And that was true not just for queer people, as Brian kind of indicated. There was a lot, I think there was a lot of sex during the war, let's put it that way.
I suppose that's a good way to end, I guess. It sort of ties in quite well with Dr. Leanne McCormick's talk next month, our talk Ruined by Yanks, on the 10th of March, same time, 7 o'clock on Zoom. We should be looking at the relationships between local Northern Irish women and the American personnel that were based in Northern Ireland. and how that sort of that changed society, and the culture clash as well that was there. And I'm sure, as many of you have heard, and I'm sure Leanne will refer to next week, was overpaid, oversexed, and over here about the Americans. But certainly it's something that she will talk about more next month. But just while we're still here, just any final questions for Michael before we log off? I think that's us, Michael. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much.
Sorry, just one hand just came up right at the very end. Who was it? I can't even see who it is. There we go. Do you want to come in? Is it Ange?
Sorry, it was just supposed to be a wee clapping reaction.
Oh, sorry. No, that's all right. Sorry to put you on the spot then.
Thanks. Thank you for the talk, Michael.
Thanks, Ange. Jeff,
Michael.
did you want to say something? I think Jeff did. You want to say something, Alan?
Yeah.
Well, sorry, I missed the very beginning of it. I'm sorry, Michael.
No, don't worry, Jeff.
I just wondered, did you mention the Brian Moore novel, Emperor of Ice Cream? And
I did, Jeff. Thanks,
Yeah.
I did. And I want to. I acknowledged. I know you mentioned to me you had a friend, isn't that right? Who remembered the war years and was. I think you described it was like opening a treasure chest, according to this friend of yours.
well, yes, it was the blackout, and even during the Blitz, people were on the go because the whole place was in chaos. It was just an opportunity set up. The other thing that thinking, and again you may have mentioned it, is how the war changed all, particularly in the naval ports in the States, like Los Angeles and San Francisco. Just the arrival of hundreds of thousands of men out of their normal surroundings, and the gay scene flourished as a consequence, and that led on to the developments of the gay political movement.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, and I think what you mentioned in terms of the blackout, Jeff, the fact that people, well, and people in the armed forces as well, you never knew, when your life would end potentially, whether you were going to be killed in an air raid, whether you were going to be killed in battle, and I think that probably added to the sense of people enjoying life, taking each day as it came. So thanks, Jeff.
Can I ask another quick question? Sorry.
Yeah, Amy.
So many questions. Thank you. Really, really enjoyed that. Was Brian Moore gay?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
No, he was very, very heterosexual, I think, but very advanced for his time, and a very good observer of things around him in Belfast in the 1940s, particularly.
It's a great novel. If any of you haven't read it, I would say I read it. Actually, shamefully, I only read it for the first time last year, The Emperor of Ice Cream. But I think it's one of the great coming of age novels. I found it really moving, funny. It's so evocative of what Belfast would have been like, in the early years of the Second World War. Yeah, I definitely recommend it.
Well, I have it upstairs, so I will start on it based on your recommendation.
Great, get reading, Amy. Get started.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I think we'll leave it there, folks. Otherwise, Michael and I will be in the office all night at this rate. So thank you all very much once again for joining us, and hopefully we shall see you all next month for Dr. Leanne McCormick's talk as well. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Everyone.
Thank you.